For over 2 decades, Saddam Hussein stood unchallenged at the top of Iraq's political system, enforcing loyalty with bullets and silence with torture. But beneath the surface, his empire of fear was rotting, and in 2003, the fall came hard. The world watched as his dictatorship crumbled. Saddam Hussein was born on April 28, 1937, in the village of Al-Awja, just outside Tikrit in northern Iraq. His early life was marked by severe hardship. His father disappeared before he was born, and his stepfather was abusive. Growing up in poverty, Saddam was sent to live with his uncle, Khair al-Tulfa, a fervent Arab nationalist and former army officer who strongly influenced Saddam's political views. As a teenager, Saddam moved to Baghdad to pursue his education and become involved in politics at a young age. In 1957, at just 20 years old, he joined the Arab Socialist Ba'ath Party, which advocated for pan-Arab unity, socialism, and the overthrow of colonial and monarchical systems in the Arab world. 2 years later, he took part in a failed assassination attempt on Iraq Prime Minister Abd al-Karim Qasim, forcing him to flee to Syria and later Egypt, where he continued his political activities while studying law. After returning to Iraq in the mid-1960s, Saddam was arrested for his Ba'athist activities, but managed to escape from prison in 1967 under mysterious circumstances. By 1968, the Ba'ath Party seized power in a coup, and Saddam, though not yet president, became one of the most powerful figures in the country. As deputy to President Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr, he took control of key government portfolios, including internal security and intelligence, and was instrumental in purging rivals and consolidating the party's control. Over the next decade, Saddam systematically built a cult of personality and strengthened his grip on the state. In July 1979, he forced al-Bakr to resign and assumed the presidency. Within days of taking office, he convened a party conference where he announced the discovery of a conspiracy and ordered the execution of several top officials. This brutal purge sent a clear message that dissent would not be tolerated and marked the beginning of Saddam's authoritarian rule. From that point on, he ruled Iraq with absolute authority, using fear, propaganda, and violence to crush any opposition. To maintain control, Saddam built one of the most extensive internal security networks in the Middle East. Multiple overlapping agencies, such as the Mukhabarat, Amn al-Qas, and Amn al-Am, were tasked with surveilling the population, rooting out dissent, and spreading fear. These agencies operated with almost complete impunity, often arresting people based on the slightest suspicion. Neighbors, co-workers, and even family members could be secret informants. Wiretaps, surveillance, and surprise raids became part of daily life. Torture was not just used, it was systematized. Detainees were subjected to beatings, electric shocks, acid baths, and mutilation. Some prisons, like Abu Ghraib, became infamous for the horrors that happened behind their walls, long before the American occupation. Political prisoners were held incommunicado, denied access to lawyers or fair trials. Many simply vanished, presumed dead, and their families were left with no answers. Even the slightest hint of disloyalty could cost someone their life. Telling a joke about Saddam, criticizing the government, or having contact with foreigners could lead to arrest. Entire families could be punished for one person's actions, with children sometimes imprisoned or executed alongside their parents. Public executions were used to instill fear, often televised or carried out in front of crowds. Saddam's regime didn't just target political opponents. It also focused on ethnic and religious groups seen as threats. Shiite Muslims, Kurds, and Marsh Arabs were especially vulnerable, often accused of being traitors or foreign agents. Repression wasn't random. It was strategic and brutal, calculated to crush any potential challenge before it could begin. By the mid-1980s, Iraqis had learned that silence and obedience were often the only way to survive. With the opposition crushed at home, Saddam turned his eyes outward. In September 1980, he ordered a surprise invasion of Iran, believing that the newly formed Islamic Republic, still reeling from the overthrow of the Shah, was weak and disorganized. He saw an opportunity to assert Iraq's dominance in the region and seize control of the disputed Shatt al-Arab waterway, a key strategic and economic point. But what he expected to be a quick and decisive campaign turned into a grueling 8-year conflict that devastated both nations. The Iran-Iraq War became one of the longest conventional wars of the 20th century, with front lines barely shifting for years. Saddam's forces faced fierce resistance from Iranian soldiers, including waves of young volunteers who were sent into battle with minimal training. As the war dragged on, the Iraqi regime grew increasingly desperate to gain an advantage. By the mid-1980s, Iraq began using chemical weapons on a large scale, despite being a signatory of the 1925 Geneva Protocol, which banned their use. Iraqi forces deployed mustard gas, taboon, and sarin gas against Iranian troops, often in large quantities. These weapons caused excruciating burns, suffocation, and long-term neurological damage. Many of the victims were young conscripts or civilians caught near the front line, including entire villages hit by gas shells. One of the most notorious incidents occurred during Operation Fowl in 1986, when Iraqi forces used massive chemical attacks to retake territory from Iran. In some battles, they combined chemical weapons with conventional artillery to create lethal kill zones. The use of poison gas gave Iraq a brutal edge and helped push Iranian forces back, but at a staggering human cost. Saddam's use of chemical weapons wasn't limited to the battlefield. The war served as a testing ground for methods later used against his own people, especially the Kurds. Despite widespread international condemnation and clear evidence of war crimes, Saddam faced little immediate consequence. Some Western governments, including the United States, quickly continued to support Iraq diplomatically and materially, viewing Saddam as a bulwark against the spread of Iranian-style revolution. By the war's end in 1988, nearly 1 million people had died, soldiers and civilians alike. Cities and oil fields were left in ruins, economically drained and socially fractured. Both countries emerged deeply scarred. But the worst was yet to come, this time not against a foreign enemy, but against his own people. From 1986 to 1989, Saddam Hussein unleashed one of the most brutal campaigns of internal repression in modern history, known as the Anfal campaign, named after a chapter in the Quran referring to the spoils of war. It was designed to crush Kurdish resistance in northern Iraq. Saddam's government accused Kurdish groups of collaborating with Iran during the Iran-Iraq War, and used that as justification for a sweeping military operation targeting Kurdish civilians. The campaign was orchestrated by Saddam's cousin, Ali Hassan al-Majid, who became known as Chemical Ali for his ruthless attacks. Under his direction, Iraqi forces carried out systematic attacks on Kurdish villages. Entire communities were rounded up and transported to detention centers or execution sites. Villages were razed, farmland destroyed, and infrastructure was leveled to prevent people from returning. Men and boys were often separated from their families and executed en masse, while women and children were imprisoned or forcibly relocated to camps in the south. The Anfal campaign wasn't just about military suppression. It was designed to permanently break the Kurdish population's ability to resist. Over 4,000 villages were destroyed, and as many as 180,000 Kurds are believed to have died during the operation, many of them never formally identified or buried. Mass graves containing thousands of bodies have been discovered across the region. The most horrific moment came in March 1988, when Iraqi warplanes dropped chemical weapons on the town of Halabja. A mixture of mustard gas and nerve agents like sarin and VX blanketed the area. Within hours, thousands of civilians lay dead in the streets, in their homes and fields. Survivors were left with chronic respiratory issues, birth defects, and psychological trauma that persists to this day. Despite clear evidence of atrocities, the Iraqi government denied wrongdoing for years. It wasn't until after Saddam's fall that the scale of the Anfal campaign became fully known. International courts and human rights organizations have since recognized it as an act of genocide. These atrocities left scars that Iraq still carries today. After Saddam was removed from power in 2003, mass graves began to surface all over the country, quiet patches of land that held the remains of those who had vanished during his decades in power. Most of the victims were from groups that Saddam had targeted over the years. Kurds from the north, Shia Muslims from the south, Marsh Arabs whose communities were drained and destroyed, and political opponents from all backgrounds. In some cases, entire families were taken in the middle of the night and never seen again. The regime kept little or no records, making identification extremely difficult. Many of the remains were found bound, blindfolded, and shot. Some buried in shallow pits only meters from where they were executed. One of the most disturbing discoveries was in Makhawil, south of Baghdad, where in 2003 investigators uncovered a grave containing over 2,000 bodies. Another was in Khatra, where mass graves were linked to the Anfal campaign, with evidence pointing to the execution of Kurdish women and children. In many of these sites, personal belongings were found with the remains, frozen in time, just showing how deep his crimes had gone. And those crimes weren't just limited to the battlefield or remote villages. They were systematized behind prison walls. Saddam's regime ran a network of detention centers where torture wasn't just tolerated, it was institutionalized. Facilities like Abu Ghraib, Al-Hakimiyya in Basra, and the Mukhabarat headquarters in Baghdad were notorious, not only in Iraq but around the world, for the horrors that took place within their walls. Inside these prisons, detainees endured routine electric shocks, beatings with metal cables, burning, and the use of acid or chemicals to disfigure them. Some were subjected to sexual abuse or forced into stressful positions for days at a time. One of the most feared tactics was the public or private torture of family members in front of the detainees, a cruel strategy designed to shatter the will of even the most resistant prisoners. Many victims were arrested for the slightest perceived disloyalty. Trials, if they happened at all, were meaningless performances with predetermined outcomes. The security services operated largely in secret, and many prisoners were held without ever being formally charged. Testimonies from survivors and defectors detailed the psychological abuse as well. Threats, mock executions, and the isolation of prisoners in tiny, lightless cells for months or even years. Some detainees were reportedly used for medical experiments or denied food and water as a means of slow punishment. This system of control was put to the test in 1991, after the Gulf War, as Iraqi forces were retreating from Kuwait and the regime appeared weakened. A wave of uprisings broke out across Iraq. In the south, the Shia population, long marginalized and repressed under Saddam's Sunni-dominated government, saw an opportunity to rise up. Inspired by the broadcasts from US-led coalition forces urging Iraqis to overthrow Saddam, thousands of civilians and army deserters took to the streets in towns like Basra, Najaf, Karbala, Nasiriyah, and Amara. But the rebellion was short-lived. Saddam responded with swift and merciless force. Elite units of the Republican Guard, loyal only to the regime, were deployed with tanks, heavy artillery, and helicopter gunships. In many areas, the fighting resembled open warfare, with entire neighborhoods shelled indiscriminately. In Karbala, one of the holiest cities for Shia Muslims, Saddam's forces launched a brutal crackdown, reportedly firing rockets into residential areas and sacred sites. The golden dome of the Imam Hussein shrine was damaged during these operations, a powerful symbol of how far the regime was willing to go to crush resistance, even if it meant violating one of Shiism's most sacred places. In Najaf, another holy city, the Imam Ali shrine also came under fire. Religious clerics and community leaders were arrested, executed, or simply disappeared. Entire families were rounded up, accused of supporting the rebels, and in many cases, never seen again. The regime used bulldozers to dig mass graves for the victims. sometimes burying people alive. Estimates of the death toll range from 30,000 to 100,000, but exact numbers remain uncertain due to the secretive nature of the crackdown and the chaos that followed. Saddam's forces also imposed collective punishment on the southern regions, cutting off water, electricity, and food supplies, and targeting civilians with suspected rebel ties. Cities were left in ruins, their populations traumatized and impoverished. After regaining control, Saddam focused on erasing any memory of uprising. He ordered the reconstruction of damaged religious sites, but only under the supervision of the regime, with no acknowledgement of the atrocities committed. Surveillance in the south was intensified, and any sign of dissent was dealt with swiftly. While Iraq bled internally, the world responded to Saddam's aggression abroad. Following Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in August 1990, the United Nations swiftly imposed comprehensive economic sanctions aimed at forcing Saddam Hussein to withdraw. After the war ended in 1991, the sanctions remained in place to pressure Iraq into dismantling its weapons of mass destruction programs. However, instead of weakening the regime, the sanctions disproportionately affected the Iraqi population. The restrictions severely limited Iraq's ability to export oil, which was the backbone of its economy. With revenue streams cut off, the country's infrastructure began to deteriorate rapidly. Imports of essential goods, including food and medical supplies, were either banned or heavily regulated, leading to chronic shortages across the country. Hospitals ran out of basic medicines and equipment, and water treatment facilities, already damaged during the Gulf War, could not be repaired or maintained due to the embargo on certain industrial materials. As a result, waterborne diseases like cholera and dysentery spread through urban and rural areas alike. Children were especially hard hit. According to UNICEF reports from the 1990s, child mortality rate in Iraq more than doubled under the sanctions regime. Malnutrition became widespread, and thousands of children died annually from preventable illnesses due to lack of access to proper care and nutrition. Schools lacked supplies, power outages were frequent, and most families struggled to afford even the most basic items like cooking oil or soap. Meanwhile, Saddam's regime manipulated the suffering for political gain. The state-controlled media highlighted images of starving children and empty hospital wards, presenting them as evidence of Western cruelty. At the same time, Saddam prioritized military and security expenditures, ensuring that his inner circle and loyal military units remained well-resourced. The black market flourished under these conditions, often controlled by regime loyalists who profited from the scarcity. In 1996, under mounting international pressure, the UN introduced the Oil for Food program, which allowed Iraq to sell limited amounts of oil in exchange for humanitarian goods. And while it provided some relief, the program was riddled with corruption and failed to fully address the crisis. Saddam's government frequently diverted resources meant for the population, using the opportunity to reward allies and maintain control. But time was running out. By 2003, Saddam's regime ultimately unraveled under the weight of foreign military intervention. The United States, under President George W. Bush, launched the invasion of Iraq in March 2003, citing Saddam's alleged possession of weapons of mass destruction and supposed ties to terrorist groups like al-Qaeda. Although the existence of such weapons was never confirmed, the war proceeded with strong support from the United Kingdom and other coalition partners. The campaign, known as Operation Iraqi Freedom, began with intense aerial bombardments, followed by a swift ground assault. Within just 3 weeks, U.S. forces had taken Baghdad. The speed of the regime's collapse stunned many. Iraqi military resistance disintegrated quickly, and government institutions crumbled. Images of Saddam's statue being pulled down in Firdos Square became a symbol of the end of his rule. However, even as his government fell apart, Saddam managed to escape capture and vanish from public view, sparking an intensive manhunt. For months, Saddam remained hidden in a rural area near his birthplace of Tikrit, relying on loyal tribal connections and a network of underground bunkers and safe houses. On December 13, 2003, U.S. forces found him hiding in a small underground hole near the village of Ad-Dawr, dubbed the Spider Hole. It was cramped, unsanitary, and barely large enough for him to lie down. He was armed but did not resist arrest. Saddam was handed over to Iraqi authorities and placed on trial for crimes against humanity. The proceedings, held under the Iraqi Special Tribunal, focused on the 1982 Dujail massacre, in which 148 Shia men and boys were executed following a failed assassination attempt on Saddam in the town of Dujail. The trial, broadcast publicly, was controversial, marred with accusations of bias, political pressure, and security issues. 3 defense lawyers were assassinated during the trial, and Saddam frequently interrupted the proceedings, refusing to recognize the court's legitimacy. Nevertheless, on November 5, 2006, he was found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. The sentence was carried out on December 30, 2006, just before sunrise. The execution was filmed on a mobile phone and leaked online, showing chaotic scenes as Saddam was taunted by guards in his final moments. The footage provoked outrage among some and satisfaction among others, reflecting the deep divisions that still haunted Iraq. His death marked the final chapter in one of the most brutal dictatorships of the modern Middle East. But his fall also ushered in a new era of instability. In the power vacuum that followed, Iraq descended into sectarian violence, insurgency, and years of turmoil that would cost hundreds of thousands of lives and reshape the region for decades to come. While Saddam's regime ended, the consequences of his rule and the manner of his downfall continued to echo long after his execution. At the height of his power in the 1930s, Benito Mussolini controlled every part of Italy. His rule was filled with violence, but his world collapsed when the Allies pushed into Italy during World War II. Betrayed by his own people and hunted like an animal, he tried to escape, but in 1945, he was eventually captured and executed. However, his darkest crimes happened long before his death. As a child, Mussolini was known for being violent and mean. He picked fights with other students and teachers. When he was just 11 years old, he stabbed a classmate with a penknife during an argument. He was expelled from several schools and had a reputation for being rude, angry, and always looking for trouble. Despite this, he was smart and later got a teaching certificate in 1901. He briefly worked as a school teacher, but he hated the job and didn't last long. In his early 20s, Mussolini became involved in socialist politics. He joined the Italian Socialist Party and edited socialist newspapers, including Avanti, one of the most important left-wing papers in Italy at the time. At first, he spoke against war, capitalism, and the ruling class. But during World War I, his ideas began to change. In 1914, he shocked the socialist movement by suddenly supporting the war and calling for Italy to join. This got him kicked out of the party. After that, he started shifting to nationalism and began dreaming of a strong, united Italy, led by him. In 1919, right after World War I ended, Mussolini founded a new political group called the Fasci di Combattimento, which means combat leagues. These groups later became the National Fascist Party. The movement was violent, angry, and very extreme. Mussolini promised to bring order to Italy by crushing communists, ending strikes, and making Italy powerful again. But instead of talking, his followers, mostly ex-soldiers and jobless men, took to the streets with clubs and knives. They wore black shirts and were known as the Black Shirts. They beat up union leaders, burned down socialist offices, and even killed political enemies. They often attacked in the middle of the night, wearing masks and carrying castor oil, which they forced victims to drink as a form of public humiliation and torture. Mussolini wasn't shy about using terror. He believed that fear was the best way to control people. By 1921, fascist violence had grown so much that even people who didn't support Mussolini started to think he might bring order to a broken country. Italy was in chaos after the war. Unemployment was high, strikes were everywhere, and people feared a communist revolution like the one that happened in Russia in 1917. Then in October 1922, Mussolini made his move. He organized the March on Rome, where about 30,000 black shirts marched towards the capital. It was mostly a bluff, but it worked. The government panicked. King Victor Emmanuel III, instead of calling the army to stop them, invited Mussolini to form a government. He was only 39 years old when he became Prime Minister of Italy. As soon as Mussolini came to power, he started building a system based on total control. Italy wasn't just ruled by a government anymore. It was ruled by one man. Within just a few days, he made sure no one could speak, act, or even think freely without risking their life. By 1925, Mussolini had turned Italy into a full-blown dictatorship. All political parties except his own were banned. The Italian parliament became useless. Mussolini picked who could join, and they just followed orders. He shut down hundreds of newspapers, arrested journalists, and forced editors to print only pro-fascist news. If a paper dared to criticize him, it was shut down immediately. Even jokes about him were dangerous. Anyone who spoke out or even seemed suspicious could vanish overnight. Some were grabbed from their homes in the middle of the night. Others were taken off the streets, blindfolded, and locked up. Many were never seen again. The prisons filled up with innocent people, teachers, writers, union leaders, students. Many were accused of anti-fascist thinking, even if they hadn't done anything. Some were sent to remote prison islands like Ventotene, Bonza, and Ustica, where they lived in horrible conditions far from their families. There were no fair trials. You were guilty the moment someone reported you. To enforce his rule, Mussolini created a terrifying secret police force known as the OVRA, short for the Organization for Vigilance and Repression of Anti-Fascism. Created around 1927, the OVRA operated in the shadows. They kept secret files on more than 130,000 Italians. They tapped phones, read personal letters, followed people through the streets, and used spies to report on anyone who said something wrong. People never knew who to trust. Your neighbor, your co-worker, even your family could report you. If someone was arrested by the OVRA, the experience was terrifying. Torture was common. Suspects were beaten, starved, or locked in dark, cold cells for weeks. Some were forced to sign fake confessions. Others were simply killed. Fear became part of everyday life. People learned to stay quiet, never speak politics, and always smile in public. It was the only way to survive. And Mussolini didn't stop with adults. He targeted children too. He believed the best way to keep power was to shape young minds before they had a chance to think for themselves. Schools were forced to teach fascist ideas. Textbooks were rewritten to glorify Mussolini and his vision of a powerful Italy. History was twisted, facts were changed, and Mussolini was made to look like a hero in every lesson. Students had to wear uniforms, give the fascist salute, and chant slogans like, "Mussolini is always right." There was no room for disagreement. Children were taught that the war was noble and that dying for Italy was the greatest honor. School programs and youth groups like the Opera Nazionale Balilla trained boys to be soldiers and girls to be obedient mothers. They marched, learned how to handle weapons, and practiced military drills. Even games became war training. The brainwashing worked. Many children grew up idolizing Mussolini. They didn't question what they were told because they never learned how to. By the 1930s, Mussolini had created a generation raised on lies, fear, and blind loyalty. It was one of his most dangerous accomplishments. One of the most brutal and disturbing parts of Mussolini's reign happened far from Italy, in East Africa, especially in Ethiopia. Mussolini had a dream. He wanted to rebuild a great empire, just like ancient Rome. To do that, he believed Italy needed to conquer and control other countries, especially in Africa. And he saw Ethiopia as a perfect target. In October 1935, Mussolini ordered the Italian army to invade Ethiopia, also known as Abyssinia. At the time, Ethiopia was one of the few African countries that hadn't been colonized by a European power. It had defeated Italy before in the Battle of Adwa in 1896, and Mussolini wanted revenge. He also wanted to show the world that Italy was strong. The way he did it was horrifying. The war wasn't just about fighting soldiers. It became a war against civilians, against nature, and against basic humanity. The Italian army used chemical weapons, especially mustard gas, which had already been banned under the 1925 Geneva Protocol. But Mussolini didn't care. He gave secret orders to use gas from the air, from tanks, and even in bombs. Italian planes dropped mustard gas on villages, farms, and forests. Rivers were poisoned, so people couldn't drink or wash. Even Red Cross hospitals, which were supposed to be protected under international law, were bombed. Doctors and nurses died alongside the wounded. Whole communities were burned or poisoned alive. The chemicals caused people to die in the most painful ways, choking, burning, or bleeding through their skin. Many who survived were left disfigured or blind. It's estimated that between 300,000 and 500,000 Ethiopians were killed between 1935 and 1941 during Italy's invasion and occupation. The exact number may never be known because so many villages were destroyed and so many bodies were just never found. The killing didn't stop once the fighting was over. Italy stayed in Ethiopia until 1941, and during those 6 years, the violence continued. One of the darkest moments came in May 1937 in the holy town of Debre Libanos. 2 months earlier, on February 19, 1937, there had been an attempted assassination of Rodolfo Graziani, the top Italian official in Ethiopia at the time. He survived, but Mussolini was furious. He wanted revenge, not just against the attackers, but against the entire population. The Italians blamed the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, saying the monks and priests had helped the rebels. Graziani ordered a massacre. Between May 21 and 29, Italian troops entered Debre Libanos Monastery, one of the holiest places in the country. More than 2,000 people, mostly monks, priests, nuns, and churchgoers, were murdered in cold blood. Some were shot, others were stabbed with bayonets, and some were even burned alive. The killings were done methodically. Victims were rounded up, forced to kneel, and executed one by one. Some were even tortured for hours before being killed. The massacre didn't stop in the monastery. The Italians also burned nearby villages, killing men, women, and children. Survivors told of babies thrown into fires and elders beaten to death with rifle butts. Homes were looted and destroyed. What makes this even more shocking is that these were war crimes, openly committed and even photographed by some Italian soldiers. But Mussolini and his commanders never faced punishment. In fact, Graziani was later honored by the fascist regime as a hero. Ethiopians were treated as less than human. Racial laws were passed to keep Italians and Africans apart. Mixed marriages were banned, and the local people could be beaten or jailed for small things like speaking against Italians or even walking on the wrong side of the road. Many Italians in the army believed they were superior, and Mussolini encouraged this thinking. He talked about civilizing Africa, but what really happened was slavery, torture, and mass murder. For much of his early rule, Mussolini did not focus on race or religion. In fact, there were Jewish members in his fascist party when it first started in 1919. But all of that changed in the late 1930s when Mussolini grew closer to Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. Mussolini admired Hitler's strength and the way he ruled with fear. Slowly, he began to copy Nazi ideas, especially when it came to racism and anti-Semitism. In 1938, Mussolini passed the Italian racial laws, also known as the Manifesto of Race. These laws completely changed life for Jewish people in Italy. Within days, Jews were banned from teaching, going to school, serving in the military, or holding government jobs. Jewish doctors couldn't treat non-Jewish patients. Businesses owned by Jews were taken away or forced to shut down. Jews were kicked out of public parks, libraries, and universities. At first, these laws were terrible, but didn't involve mass killing like in Nazi Germany. That changed in 1943 after Mussolini was removed from power and then rescued by German forces. Hitler helped Mussolini set up a puppet government in the north of Italy called the Italian Social Republic. This so-called republic had no real power. It was completely controlled by the Nazis. and it became a dangerous place for Jews. Between 1943 and 1945, more than 7,500 Italian Jews were rounded up by the fascist police and German soldiers. They were forced into crowded trains with no food, no water, and no idea where they were going. Many were sent to Auschwitz. Others ended up in Bergen-Belsen, Mauthausen, and other camps, and most of them never came back. Whole families were wiped out. Some Jews were hidden by brave Italians who risked their lives to help. Many were caught. The trains they were packed into were freezing in the winter and boiling hot in the summer. People died just on the way there. Mussolini didn't just allow this to happen. He helped it. His government provided names, addresses, and identification papers. He signed orders that allowed Jews to be handed over to the Nazis. He knew they were being sent to die, even when he saw evidence of the death camps. He never tried to stop the deportations. Mussolini's racism didn't only target Jews. In Italy's African colonies, especially Libya, Eritrea, and Somalia, the fascist regime passed racist laws that treated local people as second-class citizens, or even worse. In Libya, Mussolini's army carried out one of its worst crimes. From 1929 to 1934, thousands of Bedouins, nomadic Arab tribes, were rounded up and forced into concentration camps deep in the desert. The fascists wanted to crush any resistance and steal the land for Italian settlers. So they burned villages, took away animals, and arrested anyone who refused to obey. The camps were a death sentence. People lived in tents with no floors, surrounded by barbed wire. There was no clean water, barely any food, and no medicine. Disease spread quickly. Many died of starvation, thirst, or illness. Historians estimate that up to 100,000 Libyans died during this brutal campaign. In Eritrea, similar racist policies were enforced. Under Mussolini's fascist rule, women in Italy and the colonies were stripped of power, freedom, and basic human dignity. Mussolini believed that women's only job was to serve men and produce children for the state. His regime turned this belief into law. Inside Italy, Mussolini passed strict rules about what women could and couldn't do. By the late 1920s, women were pushed out of professional jobs like law, politics, and even teaching in high schools. They were told to get married, stay at home, and have as many children as possible. The state rewarded women not for intelligence or talent, but for giving birth. If a woman had 6 or more children, she could receive a medal from the government. Those with 10 or more were called heroic mothers. But it wasn't out of care. It was all about building a stronger army. More babies meant more future soldiers for Mussolini's wars. Birth control and abortion were banned. Doctors were ordered to report women who asked about it. Even talking about family planning was seen as unpatriotic. Women who didn't marry or couldn't have children were shamed by society and the government. Their only value was their womb. But the situation was even worse in the African colonies. During the invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 and throughout the occupation that followed, Italian soldiers committed mass rape. Women and girls, sometimes as young as 11 or 12 years old, were dragged from their homes and assaulted in front of their families. Many women were killed afterwards, either to hide the crime or simply because the soldiers could do whatever they wanted without punishment. Survivors often faced even more horror. Some were forced into military brothels or camps, where they were used as sex slaves by Italian officers. They were beaten, starved, and raped repeatedly. In Libya, similar abuses were carried out. The fascist army rounded up Bedouin women and girls, accusing them of helping resistance fighters. Many were imprisoned in harsh desert camps. The men were killed or sent away, and the women were left behind with the soldiers. Stories from survivors tell of daily abuse. No food, no protection. Back in Italy, women who tried to speak out or fight back were also crushed by Mussolini's system. If a woman joined an anti-fascist group or protested against the regime, she could be arrested without trial. Even worse, some women were forced into psychiatric hospitals, not because they were mentally ill, but because they refused to stay quiet. Doctors gave them electric shocks, strong sedatives, or locked them in isolation for days. It was a cruel way to silence anyone who didn't fit the fascist ideal of a quiet, obedient wife and mother. Mussolini saw himself as a godlike figure. He made people call him Il Duce, which means the leader. His pictures were everywhere, in classrooms, offices, and streets. People were forced to cheer for him, even if they hated him. He held huge parades and speeches to show off his power. But behind the scenes, Mussolini was paranoid and insecure. He had over 20 different bodyguards and was constantly afraid of being killed. He even banned people from walking behind him. He also made Italy enter World War II in 1940, thinking it would make him more powerful. But it was a disaster. Italian soldiers weren't ready, and they lost badly. Towns were bombed, soldiers died in the thousands, and people starved. By April 1945, the war was almost over. Germany was falling, and Italy was in ruins. Mussolini tried to escape with his lover Clara Petacci, dressed as a German soldier. But on April 27, 1945, partisans stopped them near Lake Como. The next day, on April 28, 1945, Mussolini and Clara were shot without trial. The execution took place in the small town of Giulini di Mezzegra. Some say they were shot in the chest. Others say they were machine-gunned. Either way, it was quick. Their bodies were then thrown into a truck and taken to the Piazzale Loreto in Milan, the same place where Mussolini had once hung the bodies of partisans in 1944. This time it was his turn. His corpse, along with Clara's and a few other fascist leaders, was hung upside down by meat hooks at a gas station. People spat on them, threw rocks, kicked them, and even shot at the bodies. It was a moment of pure rage. Mussolini left Italy in ruins. His crimes were not just political, they were deeply human. Many documents about his regime are still being uncovered today, showing just how far his cruelty went. From a small town in Georgia, Joseph Stalin rose to lead one of the world's most powerful nations. His rule was marked by ruthless control, starvation, and mass imprisonment. He crushed opposition without mercy. Yet after decades of terror, his power finally slipped away, ending with his death in 1953, a lonely end to a reign that changed the world forever. Stalin was born as Joseph Vissarionis Dzhugashvili on December 18, 1878, in the town of Gori in Georgia, which at the time was part of the Russian Empire. His early life was filled with poverty, violence, and instability. His father, a shoemaker, was an alcoholic who often beat his wife and son. Stalin's mother was deeply religious and sent him to a church school with hopes that he would become a priest. But Stalin rejected religion early on and was eventually expelled from the Tiflis Theological Seminary in 1899, likely for spreading Marxist ideas. That expulsion marked the beginning of his involvement in revolutionary politics. In the early 1900s, Stalin joined the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, aligning himself with the Bolshevik faction led by Vladimir Lenin. He took part in organizing strikes, robberies, and underground propaganda, acts that got him arrested multiple times and exiled to Siberia. But these hardships only deepened his commitment to the revolution. By 1912, he had adopted the name Stalin, meaning man of steel, and began writing for Pravda, the Bolshevik newspaper. He wasn't particularly charismatic, and his speeches lacked the passion of more popular revolutionaries like Trotsky. But Stalin made up for it with cunning and political ruthlessness. When the Bolsheviks seized power in 1917 after the October Revolution, Stalin gained a position in the new government. In 1922, Lenin appointed him General Secretary of the Communist Party, a role that, at the time, seemed administrative. But Stalin used it to his advantage, placing loyal allies in key positions across the party and gathering detailed information on rivals, often through spying and blackmail. Lenin grew suspicious of Stalin towards the end of his life. In what became known as Lenin's Testament, he warned other party members that Stalin was too rude, too power-hungry, and should be removed from his position. But after Lenin suffered several strokes and eventually died in January 1924, Stalin suppressed this warning and made sure it never gained traction among party leaders. Instead of stepping aside, Stalin began a campaign to consolidate power. He first aligned with Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev to sideline Leon Trotsky, who many assumed would succeed Lenin. Trotsky was forced out of his military role and eventually exiled from the country altogether in 1929. Stalin then turned on Zinoviev and Kamenev, accusing them of factionalism and having them expelled from the party. Over time, Stalin eliminated almost all his political rivals, often using fabricated charges, public humiliation, and secret executions to do so. By 1928, Stalin had absolute control over the Communist Party, and by extension the Soviet Union. That same year, he launched the first five-year plan, a massive economic project meant to transform the country from a poor, farming-based society into a powerful industrial nation. The plan focused on rapid industrial growth, especially in steel, coal, and heavy machinery. But to make it work, Stalin needed full control over food and labor. That's when he turned to agriculture, and millions of lives were about to be ruined. He forced farmers across the Soviet Union to give up their private land, livestock, and tools. These were small farmers, known as kulaks, many of whom had worked the same land for generations. Stalin labeled them as greedy enemies of the state, simply because they owned slightly more than others. He claimed they were standing in the way of progress, and used that as an excuse to crush them. Their land was taken, and they were forced into massive collective farms run by the government. This process was called collectivization, and it wasn't optional. Anyone who refused was labeled a traitor. As soon as collectivization started, the countryside erupted in chaos. Farmers killed their animals rather than hand them over. Grain production dropped sharply because people no longer had any reason to work hard on land they didn't own. But Stalin didn't see it that way. Instead of fixing the policies, he blamed the farmers themselves. He accused them of hoarding grain and sabotaging the economy. In response, he ordered mass arrests, executions, and deportations. In 1929 alone, more than 100,000 so-called kulaks were sent to forced labor camps. Thousands more were killed on the spot or died during transportation. Families were torn apart. Children were taken from their parents. Entire villages were emptied overnight. Stalin even created a campaign called dekulakization, which wasn't just about economics. It was about complete control. There were no trials, no second chances. Once labeled a kulak, you were finished. Meanwhile, the Soviet state continued to demand massive grain exports to fund industrial growth, even as food shortages spread across the country. Stalin ignored warnings from local officials and experts. When areas couldn't meet grain quotas, Red Army troops were sent in to seize what little food remained. Homes were raided, storage barns were emptied. People were left with nothing to eat. One of the most horrifying things Stalin did happened in Ukraine. Between 1932 and 1933, millions of Ukrainians starved to death. This famine, now known as the Holodomor, was one of the darkest and most brutal chapters in Soviet history. It was the result of Stalin's aggressive push for collectivization and his ruthless desire to break any form of resistance, especially from Ukraine. Ukraine had long been a fertile region with rich farmland, and its people were proud of their cultural identity. Many Ukrainian farmers were deeply opposed to Stalin's collectivization orders. They resisted giving up their land, their grain, and their independence. In Stalin's eyes, this resistance wasn't just disobedience, it was rebellion, and he was determined to crush it. In late 1932, Stalin imposed impossibly high grain quotas on Ukrainian villages. When villages failed to meet the quotas, Soviet enforcers moved in and took every bit of food they could find. Armed groups, called food requisition brigades, went from house to house, searching walls and floors for hidden supplies. If anyone was caught hiding food, they were either executed on the spot or deported to labor camps. To make things worse, Stalin introduced a law in August 1932 that became known as the Law of 5 Years of Grain. Under this law, anyone, child or adult, caught taking even a small amount of grain from a field could be sentenced to 10 years in prison or even executed. It didn't matter how hungry you were. Stealing state property even out of desperation, was treated like a serious crime. By winter, the situation was catastrophic. Entire regions were starving. The borders of Ukraine were sealed off so that people couldn't leave in search of food. Trains were stopped. Roads were blocked. Stalin even made sure that foreign aid organizations couldn't send help. The death toll grew rapidly. Estimates say that at least 3.9 million Ukrainians died during the Holodomor. But some researchers believe the real number could be over 7 million. Entire villages disappeared. Families collapsed, one by one. Survivors later spoke of eating grass, tree bark, and boiled leather. In the most extreme cases, especially in isolated villages, reports of cannibalism began to surface. Parents were forced to make choices no one should ever face. And all this time, Stalin knew. He received regular reports from the countryside. He knew people were dying by the millions, but he refused to reduce grain quotas. In fact, he increased the pressure, accusing starving Ukrainians of being lazy, disloyal, or saboteurs. While Soviet cities received food shipments and propaganda claimed the plan was a success, rural Ukraine was being erased. In 1934, something happened that changed the Soviet Union forever. Sergei Kirov, a popular Communist Party leader in Leningrad and seen by many as a possible rival to Stalin, was suddenly assassinated. The details around his death were suspicious from the start. Kirov had recently disagreed with some of Stalin's decisions, and not long after that, he was gunned down in the hallway of a government building, with barely any security around him. Many historians believe Stalin either arranged the murder himself or allowed it to happen so he could use it as a reason to go after anyone he considered a threat. Right after Kirov's death, Stalin passed new laws that allowed the secret police, known as the NKVD, to arrest people without evidence and execute them without trial. This marked the beginning of what came to be known as the Great Purge, or sometimes the Great Terror. It started quietly at first, but by 1936, it exploded into one of the most intense and violent political crackdowns in modern history. Between 1936 and 1938, Stalin's regime arrested more than 1.5 million people. People were taken from their homes in the middle of the night. Some were arrested for things as small as making a joke about Stalin or being late to a meeting. Once arrested, they were dragged into interrogation rooms where they were beaten, starved, and tortured until they confessed to crimes they didn't commit. The trials that followed were just for show. They were called show trials because everything was scripted. Judges, lawyers, and defendants all played roles. The accused were forced to confess to being traitors, spies, or enemies of the state. Many were told their families would be punished if they didn't confess. Some were promised mercy, but once they confessed, they were shot anyway. In 1937 alone, nearly 400,000 people were executed. Children of those arrested were labeled enemy offspring and placed in orphanages or sent to labor camps themselves. Stalin even turned on the Red Army, one of the strongest in the world. He ordered the arrest and execution of top military leaders, including Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, one of the Soviet Union's most respected commanders. In just a few months, around half of all army officers were either executed or imprisoned. This left the Soviet military weak and disorganized, just a few years before World War II would begin. By the end of 1938, the NKVD had executed about 700,000 people. Millions more were in camps, many of them never heard from again. Those who weren't executed were sent to the Gulag system. The Gulag system was one of the darkest parts of Stalin's reign. It was an enormous network of forced labor camps spread across the Soviet Union, especially in the coldest and most remote areas like Siberia, the Arctic, and the Far East. Gulag is short for Glavno Upravlenie Lageri, which means Main Camp Administration, and it was run by Stalin's secret police. Stalin used these camps as a tool to get rid of anyone he thought might oppose him. By 1939, there were already over 1.3 million people locked inside. But throughout Stalin's years in power, it's estimated that more than 18 million men, women, and even children passed through the gulags. These weren't just criminals. Many were teachers, doctors, engineers, students, and peasants. Inside the camps, life was unbelievably harsh. Prisoners were forced to do backbreaking labor like mining, logging, building railroads, or digging canals, all with the most basic tools. They worked 12 to 16 hours a day in extreme conditions. Food rations were tiny, barely enough to survive on. If you didn't meet your work quota for the day, your food would be cut even more. Medical care was almost non-existent. Public punishments were used to scare others into staying quiet. The weather made survival even harder. In camps like Kolyma or Vorkuta, temperatures could drop below minus 50 degrees Celsius in winter. Frostbite was normal. In these freezing zones, simply falling asleep outside could mean death. Kolyma camp was known as the land of gold and death because prisoners were forced to dig for gold while barely surviving. In some years, the death rate at Kolyma reached 30%. Almost 1 in 3 prisoners dying each year. In the first 5 years alone, over 130,000 people are believed to have died in that region. Women and children were also imprisoned. Women often faced sexual abuse from guards or other prisoners. Pregnant women gave birth in the camps, and many babies died shortly after. Some women were arrested just because their husbands had been labeled enemies of the people. Whole families were torn apart. Then in August 1939, just before World War II began, Stalin signed a secret deal with Adolf Hitler, called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Publicly, it was a non-aggression treaty between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. But the real damage came from the secret protocol attached to it. That hidden section outlined how Hitler and Stalin would divide Eastern Europe between themselves. Stalin wanted breathing room to build up Soviet power, and Hitler wanted to focus on invading Western Europe without worrying about his eastern flank. Just over a week after the pact was signed, Hitler invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, triggering World War II. 17 days later, on September 17th, Stalin invaded from the east, claiming he was protecting Ukrainians and Belarusians. In reality, it was a calculated move to claim his share of Poland, as agreed with Hitler. Stalin's troops quickly took control of eastern Poland and, not long after, occupied the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. These were independent countries, but Stalin annexed them by force in 1940, following rigged elections and the installation of puppet governments. One of the darkest outcomes of this invasion was the Katyn massacre. In the spring of 1940, the NKVD executed more than 22,000 Polish military officers, police, doctors, professors, and other members of the Polish elite. The goal was to wipe out any potential resistance. The victims were buried in mass graves in places like Katyn Forest. For decades, the Soviet government blamed the Nazis for the killings. It wasn't until 1990 that Moscow finally admitted the truth. After occupying eastern Poland and the Baltic states, Stalin began a massive campaign of forced deportations. From 1939 to 1941, more than 1.5 million people were rounded up in the middle of the night and loaded onto trains headed east. These were not just political activists or military officers. Whole families were targeted. Many were arrested for the vague crime of being socially dangerous, even if they had no political activity at all. The conditions on the trains were horrific. People were packed into cattle cars with no food, no water, and no sanitation. Some trains took weeks to reach their destinations. Hundreds died along the way, from suffocation, from starvation, or exposure. Babies and elderly people often didn't survive the journey. When the survivors arrived in places like Siberia, Kazakhstan, or the Arctic North, they found nothing but barren land and forced labor waiting for them. Stalin's dreams started to shatter on June 22, 1941, when Hitler betrayed him and launched Operation Barbarossa, a massive surprise invasion of the Soviet Union. Stalin had ignored multiple warnings, including reports from British intelligence and his own spies, believing Hitler would honor the pact. When the attack came, the Soviet military was unprepared, and the Germans advanced quickly. Stalin went silent for days, not even addressing the nation until July 3rd. As the Red Army retreated, Stalin gave brutal orders. One of the most devastating was the scorched earth policy. Destroy everything of value: food, bridges, railways, factories, so the Nazis couldn't use it. Entire villages were burned down, and millions of Soviet civilians were left with nothing. This policy, while slowing the Germans, caused immense suffering for ordinary people. They had no homes, no food, and no way to survive the advancing winter. Stalin also imposed savage military discipline. His infamous Order No. 227, issued in July 1942, made it illegal for soldiers to retreat without permission. The order created blocking detachments, Soviet troops stationed behind the front lines, whose job was to shoot any soldier who tried to flee. That year alone, more than 150,000 Soviet soldiers were executed by their own commanders. Stalin viewed these deaths as necessary sacrifices for victory. By 1944, as Soviet forces started pushing back the Nazis, Stalin turned on his own people again. He accused entire ethnic groups of helping the Germans, even without proof. On February 23rd, 24th that same year, Stalin ordered the mass deportation of the Chechens and Ingush from their homes in the North Caucasus. NKVD troops stormed villages, gave families minutes to pack, and forced them into unheated cattle cars. Roughly 500,000 people were deported in just 2 days. Later in 1944, the same happened to the Crimean Tatars. About 200,000 were deported from Crimea in a matter of days. Like the Chechens, they were accused of collaborating with the Nazis, though many had fought in the Red Army. Soviet records later showed that nearly half of the Crimean Tatars, about 46%, died within the first year from starvation, illness, and exposure. Their homes were given to Russian settlers, and their culture nearly vanished. Even after the war ended in 1945, Stalin didn't lose his grip. Instead, repression intensified. Millions of Soviet soldiers who had been held as prisoners of war by the Germans were not welcomed home. They were treated as traitors. Many were arrested and sent straight to the gulags. Stalin believed that anyone who had been outside Soviet borders might have been infected with Western ideas. In 1952, Stalin unleashed a new wave of paranoia, the anti-Jewish purge, known as the Doctors' Plot. He accused a group of Jewish doctors of conspiring to poison top Soviet officials. Though no evidence existed, many were arrested, tortured, and imprisoned. The campaign created a wave of fear across the country and led to growing anti-Semitism. Historians believe Stalin may have been preparing for mass deportations of Jews before his death. Finally, on March 5, 1953, Stalin died after suffering a massive stroke at his dacha near Moscow. He had been left alone for hours because his guards were too terrified to enter his room without permission. By the time anyone checked on him, he was barely alive. He died later that day. At first, the government honored him as a hero, but just 3 years later, in 1956, Nikita Khrushchev shocked the world by delivering a secret speech that exposed Stalin's crimes. It was the first time the Soviet people began to learn the full extent of what had happened. For the families of victims, the truth came too late. Their loved ones had been executed, exiled, or left to die in prison camps. Entire communities had been wiped out. And though Stalin was gone, the scars he left on the Soviet Union would last for generations.